Welcome to the EVready Podcast, featuring industry leaders and their perspectives on electrification, hosted by EVready Energy. Welcome to the EVready Podcast. My name is Chris Nihan, and I am glad to have David Gao, Director of Automotive Sales for North America, join us today.
Hey, what's up, buddy? It's good to connect with you. I miss seeing your smiley face on our Zoom calls. So always a pleasure, my man.
Yeah, just for context for everybody, I used to work at ChargePoint. David and I used to harass each other every single day. We don't harass each other every day anymore, but we still like to stay in touch as much as we can. And look, like we've known each other since when? 10 years ago at the SolarCity days.
Yeah.
Back when you were living in Western Massachusetts.
That's right. That's right. Some good
memories. We were trying to get you to Boston.
That's right. That's right. Good memories.
Yeah. And you know, for those who don't know David Gao, best dressed person in the room, I had to ask him to be more casual today so that I could compete. But he just has so much experience in the industry at ChargePoint, talking to different types of customers. And I wanted to have him on the podcast so that he could give his perspective on the industry. If you know David Gao, you know that he is very focused on things outside of work as well. So I want to pick his brain on that. But yeah, hopefully just have a good conversation back and forth. And yeah, again, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, man, just real quick, Chris, like just hats off to you for creating this podcast. I know that if I was either new to the industry or if I was looking to, I guess, just cut the learning curve as quickly as possible in terms of learning all things, either electric vehicle charging or maybe it's sustainability, depending on where you take this podcast. You know, I think this is a great benefit and will be a great tool to a lot of the not only sales professionals out there, but hopefully some of the customers too. So hats off.
Thanks for that. The check's in the mail. You're always welcome. You're always
right.
You're always welcome to come back on it. But yeah, hopefully this is helpful in general, this podcast, because, you know, the intention is to get industry leaders such as yourself on here every week, kind of bring in a different perspective. Because if you've been on the phone with me before and we've talked about EV charging, you've heard me say that this industry is the wild, wild west. And to get different perspectives, I think, is the best way to make, decisions for yourself. And so hopefully it's also a little bit entertaining as well.
Yeah, agreed.
So hey, first thing, because I want people to get to know you, because that's when you're at your best. Tell me a little bit about like what drives you, what makes you successful, what you do every day, like some professional tips.
Yeah, I love this. This is a topic very near and dear to my heart. So professional tips, I think, well, for starters, I think what the interesting thing about success is I think success leaves clues. And so the ability to find people like yourself or find people that share a passion for being successful and putting your best foot forward, like it's out there, and just modeling behavior that I've had the privilege of seeing in my 20-year sales career, whether that's here at ChargePoint in the executive leadership or just some of the past jobs that I've had. Jim Rohn, one of my favorite authors, and it may be in the show notes, right? Jim Rohn would be a good book for everybody to read in terms of efficiency. But Jim Rohn has a quote that says, "Work harder on yourself than you do on your job." Right. And I like to think that all of us work pretty darn hard on our job. So that means you really got to put forth some effort, really working on yourself. And to me, that's kind of mind, body, it encompasses, I know you're a workout fiend too, Chris. I think there's a discipline in those daily activities, right? And I think that discipline naturally translates over to the day-to-day activity on the job. So I guess the biggest thing would just be being a student, study, success, read as much as you can, and then just work on yourself constantly. That's what has has proven pretty successful for me.
What's the, and I won't ask this for everybody on every, podcast, but you're just so in tune with yourself. Like, what's the number one thing you do for your mental health?
Every morning I write, I write, and I get a lot of, I think, the noise out of my head and onto paper before I like start my morning routine of like working out and stuff. And I think it's just a check-in. For me, I wake up pretty early and it's quiet and there's no emails going off or anything like that. And that habit has served me well, because as you know, once you get to 8 a.m. or 9 a.m., it's live. Everything's going off, and the distractions, sure enough, will come in. So for me, writing just gets me in tune, like each and every morning, and just kind of sets the tone of a kind of this quiet place that actually I look forward to like every morning. So
that's awesome.
How about yourself? Yeah. How about yourself though, Chris? Like, what do you have going on? Like, I know you're a routine guy. Like, what's working for you?
I am. Yeah. So I have one thing that I need to do in the morning. So I have to work out. And then, so the gym I go to, anyone's familiar with a Lifetime Fitness.
Yeah.
A lot of them, they'll have a sauna, they'll have a steam room, they'll have a cold plunge. Yeah. I have to do those every single day. I'm spending 30 minutes, 45 minutes, hot room, steam room, cold plunge after working out every single day. And once I get through that, I'm right. I'm good to go.
It's kind of like bring it on, right? Like after you're able to do that, it's like,
oh yeah.
Yeah.
The cold plunge is tough. A lot of people just go in there. I have to really, mentally prepare for that thing.
So I could have swore, like, you and I discussed this like months ago, but you were like anti-cold plunge, weren't you, at one time? Or is this like a new?
Yeah. So for people who don't know my situation right now, I have a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, and my wife is due next week. Probably by the time this airs, hopefully that child will be here.
Yeah. Congrats again.
Yeah. Thank you. And so I was doing a lot of things right, but I just kind of like, I got to that point. You're kind of 3 weeks out. I think the term is nesting. But I got to the point about 3 weeks out where I said, like, starting a new company, it's taken a ton of time, but I also want to be the best version of myself, like best father. So I said, I have to get 8+ hours of sleep every night, got to work out, and I got to make sure I'm eating healthy. So like I'm kind of on my A game right now. And the capstone of that was finally getting my skinny self into the cold plunge. So I started doing that last week.
Yeah. I think it's great, man. I think it's interesting how though, like when you say you're kind of like on point, how it translates over to every other aspect of life. Like when you exercise and practice self-care, how that helps you start your own business and run the day-to-day, how that helps you be a better just man with your family. And it's just, it's that adage too, like this is a terrible analogy, but everyone's familiar with it. Like if the plane's going down, you put your oxygen mask on first and then help others. And I think that's so important, like in the day-to-day with just personal development and becoming better.
Yeah. So you got to recognize your personality and who you are and your strengths and your weaknesses. And sometimes certain qualities you have are a double-edged sword. And one of my qualities is if I, have 3 French fries, I'll go get ice cream after.
Yeah.
And then I won't go work out.
Yeah.
And then I won't answer that email, so for me, it's like, if I can always just be at the top of my game, I'm always, challenging myself to be better with every action that I take. And that gets me to where I need to be personally.
I love that, man. Yeah. Well, it's working too, buddy.
Thanks. Appreciate that. Right back at you. So what was it? When did you join ChargePoint? 4 years ago? 5 years ago?
Yeah. 5.5. Yeah.
5.5. So I'll never forget texting you when you were at SolarCity and saying, hey, there's a job open. I think it would be awesome. And I think you have a phone interview? And then they flew you out there?
I had a phone interview. Yeah. And then the next day I flew out there. Yeah.
I remember that.
Coast to coast. Yeah.
And I remember the sales leader at that time calling me afterwards and saying, that was the best interview I ever had.
Yeah. Oh, did he? Yeah. I
Yeah,
talked to him
yeah.
yesterday. Yeah.
Oh, did you? That's
Yeah.
awesome. That's
Yeah.
awesome. And your first position, like you come across better than anybody. So David Gao handles enterprise accounts in a very special and unique way within the industry. And that's always been my takeaway. I've kind of seen you always do that really well. What are the three biggest challenges? Because you've been in automotive, you've worked with fueling convenience operators,
Yeah.
you've worked with a few other tech companies. What are the three biggest challenges electrifying for enterprise customers?
Three biggest challenges. A great question, man. So I guess to frame it in a way that there's multiple verticals, right? Like when we're talking about enterprise accounts. So you had hit on this a little bit, and a lot of the sales professionals out there who are listening can probably relate to this. But as you know, Chris, automotive moves very differently than like tech, like a Meta or Facebook, right? And of course, that's different from a 7-Eleven in fueling and convenience. And so, my first step, and in any sales role outside of enterprise accounts, it's stepping into a territory in general, is where's the current business? Like, who are the current customers and what are we doing there? And furthermore, to expand on that, it's like, who's our contact there? And let's get in there and let's see, one, what's working, but I think more importantly is what's not working and where can we improve. So I think it's about building a trust from a relationship that already exists. And now if the relationship doesn't exist and it's a break-in account, I really think you've got to know that business almost better than they do, meaning you've got to know all of their office locations or all of their dealership locations or all of the gas stations that exist in the country. And then for me, it's about, you and I worked closely on this when you were at ChargePoint, is what's a good in for those customers? Like, what's going to get their attention where I can automatically come off as an expert or provide, some level of credibility in order to help them. And so I think that's the intention of any good sales professional. Is I'm not trying to sell you something. It's like, I want to help you and have a relationship for the rest of our lives. Like, that's what that's the difference between, I think, a sales rep and a sales professional, right? And so I think, like, for me, what I would do is I would map out an account. So if it is one of a very large auto group, for example, it's really drilling into the business of where are their strategic locations. And then it's like, okay, well, which OEMs have we worked with currently, or who has a program currently going on? And then maybe from there, it's sort of that above and beyond, right? Well, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Customer, I've gone ahead and done the liberty of searching and scrolling through every single program out there that's available related to funding for all of your dealerships. I provided that here for you. And I just want to, kind of get 5 minutes to just kind of point you in the right direction with this. And just, again, always staying relative to, maybe it's an article you come across, maybe it's something, just ways to stay in touch and continue to build trust. But, it takes, I think, 6 months to build a really good relationship.
Yeah.
How about yourself too, Chris? You've worked on some major accounts. Like, what's been your process on that side?
Yeah. I would say this, related to electrification. Like, I think a lot of these enterprise customers, they're not looking to electrify because they have electric cars and, they necessarily see it as the future. For them, I think it's like anything else that they're doing. It's like, how do I drive my core business? So, when you're talking to a fueling convenience company, you got to make sure that they can make money selling electricity. You have to make sure that you're increasing their ring to register.
Right.
If it's the same thing with the retail provider, how do you get, more in-store sales at a specific location? For automotive dealerships, I think a lot of the conversation has been around, how do you get more vehicles to be sold? How can you make operations more streamlined and more efficient, easier for your team? But I think, like, obviously we worked in the automotive space together, and I think the automotive space is so interesting because there's just, there's so much going on, so many unique challenges in a space that, they weren't selling electric cars before, now they are.
Right.
And it's really difficult to transition because it's not like you're going, this is apples and oranges, electric versus gas. It's not just about installing a plug in the wall. It's all right. How long is that plug going to last? And is that plug the right plug for the future? And is that plug tied to the existing electric building load? And if it is, what is of the utilities 20 utility rates, what's the best one for you? And how much more does that cost? How many times have we seen two different quotes where a customer's just looking at the charging solution quote as if that's the cost? And the reality is it's one-fourth the cost.
Right.
And so, electrification in general right now, and I think anybody who's listening to this podcast would probably agree, is it's the Wild West right now. And I think any good salesperson at this point in time is going to sort of help slow things down a bit for these enterprise customers.
Also, yeah.
Like you always say, measure twice, cut once.
Yeah.
That's what's needed in this industry right now. And I think that's what I, personally would focus on in any enterprise account, or if you are a very large company, is making sure that you understand the full picture. It's
such a good point about, because like anything that you're reading currently, like whatever it is, it's automotive news, Wall Street Journal, it's electric vehicles they're not only here, but they're coming and more hitting the road every single day. And you've got almost like this hair on fire type approach from either the GM of a dealership or an auto group. And it's so, like, I think you hit the nail on the head with, like, let's just take a breath for a moment and let's strategize not what you need in the next 3 months, but let's talk about like the next 3, 5, 10 years and what this is going to look like and how we want to set this up. Yeah. I think it's such a great point, man. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, like, if you're a fueling convenience provider, you want to make sure whatever solution that you're putting in there has some type of, because that's the difference with gas. There's a gas station in every corner, but there's no networked capability. With networked capabilities for fueling convenience operators, there's so many things to take into account. Like, how do you create a software to drive in-store sales? How do you lower the cost of charging at your location by partnering with other companies that are out there, whether it's a fleet operator or it's an auto manufacturer, car dealership, or somebody else? But the networked element of fueling that relates to charging, I think, is like this thing that is going to impact how people electrify, that just doesn't always get taken into account like it should. And then, for Tesla, what did Tesla do? They offered unlimited free supercharging for the first 10 years. And I think different people have different opinions. Like, some people don't think that mattered, or that it won't matter in the future. Other people think that it did matter and that it will matter in the future. But the reality is, either way, they pulled a major software trigger over at the beginning of this industry to gain a significant market share.
It's a big reason I purchased the Model 3. I love that. Got me. Same.
And so it'll be really interesting to see how software kind of plays out, within the different verticals. I think every single use case for different verticals uses software in a different way. And then I think the other thing, and we've talked about this a million times, but the utility grid, right? Like, the utility grid's 100 years old. There are so many factors tied to how you get charged for electricity that impact you, or that you should be thinking about when you're doing your construction. And I think a lot of the times those things are ignored or avoided, or for whatever the case may be. And for these enterprise customers, you multiply that problem times 100, times 200, times 1,000, and it can really cost a lot more money. Oh, there you go.
You put me on that. And for anyone who doesn't know, Chris introduced a book to me. God, this was probably like 6 months ago. It's Understanding Today's Electricity Business. And there's a wealth of information in there too, but you're right. I think how little people really know about what the utility and 100-year-old grid and all of that. Like, I know you had to teach me quite a bit too. So
Yeah, for me, it's just like a really interesting element of electrification. There's a lot of talk about it and
Yeah,
on the news or whatever the case may be, but it's something that I think every company should be thinking about at the beginning of their project, and at no other time.
agreed. Well said, man.
So talk to me about this. I remember when the automotive space started heating up a little bit and we started connecting about, hey, like this might be the place to be. Like what interested you in automotive, and like what still gets you excited about that space today?
Oh gosh, I remember, for me, I was almost like hoping this vertical was going to take off in this direction and that ChargePoint was going to create this team, that you ended up running. It was, I think, to be on the forefront, to be just kind of out ahead of the pack and working with a vertical that's turning on, but it's not like someone's just dimming the lights up. This was just like all of a sudden there was a
It
massive
happened at
spotlight
once.
on automotive. And man, the craziness and the um I say this respectfully, the chaos of it, of being on the forefront, was just super exciting for me. But as a sales professional, the environments that I like to thrive in are teaching, right? And I think with the dealerships, with the auto groups, it was very much about sort of taking all of the knowledge that I've had from the days at Tesla to the days at ChargePoint leading up to this role, and being able to share that with them and cut their learning curve. And I think teaching is a very powerful selling tool as well, right? Like just making sure that, any knowledge that I had, that our customers also have that same knowledge. And I think you can make, with auto, it's still, I think, very much relationship based, right? And I think, if you do right by people, like you can have an account for a lifetime. So that's what
Yeah.
attracted me to it. And I
Yeah.
thought, yeah, it was just really exciting.
And I think it was so great to see, like, what an incredible team that you were able to build with so many good people. It was just like the right group at the right time.
Yeah.
A lot of credit to you for that. Yeah, I think automotive is just interesting because as any time that electrification is affecting a certain vertical, uh, it makes it a lot more exciting. In automotive, obviously, like they need to charge their cars, they need to sell cars, like that, that's really fun for fleets. Very similar, like just like this
Yeah.
thing that really drives their core business. And I'm really excited to see what verticals exist out there where maybe electrification isn't like the first thing they think of when they're thinking about how do they run their business, where that changes over
Yeah.
time. Whether it's, maybe it's parking.
I was going to ask you, like, what vertical you think would do. I was in my head, I was like, commercial real estate kind of stands out to me a little bit. Fleet's obviously about to take off, but like, I was going to ask you your professional opinion on, like, because you kind of had the crystal ball, right, Chris, with auto. You were a year ahead of me on the ChargePoint side, like starting the auto team. So you kind of saw it. So I'm curious, like, with your crystal ball
Yeah,
right now, like, I'm wondering what you're seeing now that auto's like almost fully turned on.
yeah. I don't necessarily, I can't say that like that seemed so crystal clear at that time.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm really I'm curious for a lot of like commercial. I'm sitting in a commercial real estate building right now that has
Yeah.
charge point stations in so many locations. I'm parked at a charge point station right
Yeah.
now.
That's
I'm
great.
really curious, and so where I'm in right now is it's a company called Regis. So they have 10,000 locations across the U.S., and you pretty much pay a subscription fee, and you work out of any of these offices across the United States. And I imagine, I don't know this, but I imagine that probably stemmed from COVID, or the lack of spaces in these buildings that were being leased, and then just like a new business model. And I'm really curious to see, like, if more companies take that type of a business model in commercial real estate, or for like a parking garage, like if parking garages aren't going to be used as much anymore, how do you integrate charging or other types of businesses in order to, you know, in order to make those parking spaces valuable. So I think right now, like fleet and automotive are still core businesses that are being directly driven. Really curious to see a lot of large retail customers, how they can enable this software to drive their core businesses. I think so far in the industry, for the most part, and this is definitely not every location, but it's probably the rule opposed to the exception, is a lot of retail locations have had other companies own and operate DC chargers at their locations. There's certainly companies out there that are doing that. But I'm curious to see, we always talk about owning the experience. What other type of verticals are going to look to own the entire charging experience in the future and get a little bit closer to it. And I don't know, we'll see. I don't really have a great answer. But I think whoever solves that software experience, I think is going to be in the lead.
Now, when you say like solves the software experience, are you talking about the driver's experience overall?
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Yeah, because I think part of the driver's experience as a business is, how do I enable my core business by providing them a better experience? Like that might be a customer that they're just getting free charging at their workplace and they don't have charging at home, so they can't leave where they're working. It might be getting a smoothie at the smoothie shop next to the fast charger, or accruing a credit for a future vehicle purchase, like we always talk about. Like and I'm just curious to see how that ends up playing out. But I think with certainty, like, we have such a good example to point to. We just saw the world switch from flip phones to smartphones. And I remember when my friend came to school and showed me the first iPhone and said, this is an app. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about.
What's an app? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's the question in this space tied to software is, what's an app? What's going to drive an experience that gets somebody to change the way that they live, when they're charging.
Yeah. Really interesting.
Yeah. Well, just to stay on like the automotive theme, because we've spent so much time on it together.
Yeah.
Tell me, what do you think are the 3 biggest challenges for dealerships and dealer groups in 2023?
Dealerships and dealer groups. I'll start with like on the dealership side. I think it's like, if I were to just take Ford, for example, I think some of the, and I say this respectfully too, so some of the pressure in timelines that are presented to the individual dealerships by the OEMs, which I understand where the OEMs are coming from, certainly, right? There's a product to move, and I get it, and a great product is that. But these are large, very much construction type projects. And so I think looking at the bottom line of a dealership and the cost that's being sank into some of these initial rollouts is definitely a challenge. I think what I would like to see more of is a collaboration sort of between, maybe it's the top performing dealers in a kind of a rollout of level 2 into level 3 and then advanced level 3 type stations. On top of that, there's companies I think that are out there, that are, it's just such a hot industry right now in the automotive vertical. Is obviously there's so much demand right now that you've got companies kind of coming out of the woodwork too. And so my concern is, if you're not going with a ChargePoint or a very, a company that's been around for 15 years, if you're going with, just a newer station or something that perhaps is unproven, do you set yourself up for failure down the road, right? Like, are you going to have to replace that station, a year, 2 years from now? And is that just a sunk cost? Or, a lot of that, a lot of the talk around that. And then I guess finally, like, I think for the dealerships too, I think the biggest thing is just, it's one thing to do the project and the OEM requirements today and that's being called for, but I always caution the dealers to at least start to predict what like could be coming down the road, whether it's the OEM asking for more DC fast chargers. So what I mean by that is, if you're going to do an electrical upgrade, if you're going to do an infrastructure upgrade, let's just future proof the site, right? And although we don't know exactly what the requirements may be, we will be prepared, more or
Totally.
less. And then also for Mr. or Mrs. GM, if you ever want to sell your dealership, wow, like what a feather in your cap versus perhaps some of the other dealerships they're looking at if you've already planned accordingly around electrical infrastructure and the new owner can come in and add DC without having to do a full project, right? Like, so I mean that's a
great point.
It's a long-winded answer, man, but it's I think the dealerships are in this, it was kind of like no, not yet, and then all of a sudden it was like hurry up and go. And I think that's really I think the biggest challenge facing those guys and gals. But I'm curious, how about you though? See, like same question back to you. What do you think if you had 3 to pick from?
Well, it's funny you said it because those are obviously really big deals. I think it's really tough because when a lot of dealers and dealer groups, when they're renovating these locations, they're usually part of these like larger plans that an auto manufacturer might have for them, and charging might be one really small part of it. But the reality is, a lot of the decisions that you make on day one can impact your costs a little bit later on. I'll just give you an example. If dealers are renovating a site, or maybe they're completely restructuring a location, they might have to create, engineered drawings and designs for their location far before they might reach out to whoever it is that they're going to talk to about charging stations. And I think the challenge is like different chargers require different conduit inside of the ground. And so, you might think that your team's putting in conduit and,
Right.
and it might be good for certain stations, but it might box you out of the more advanced stations or the more modular stations. And I think that's really, it puts a dealer in a position where it's like, all right, do we rip the ground up again, or do we place additional conduit right now? Do we spend more money that we weren't planning on spending at this moment in time to get a certain unit that will be more cost effective long term? And probably, I would imagine most dealers don't have, or especially dealer groups don't have, a plan for the exact type of chargers they want and how they're going to use them to drive vehicle sales and what utility rate they're going to be on and what conduit's needed. And so not having that overarching plan prior to spending all of the money on the different things,
Right.
it's just gonna require a lot of reinvestment in the future. And that's going to be tough. That's going to be tough. So I think that's one really big thing. I think the other one is, and I, talked about it all already briefly, but, you go into certain utility territories and you install a level 2 charger, and, the quote was being compared between $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000, and they install it. And the way that it was installed cost them up an extra $100,000 a year because of the way the utility reads that rate and what their load profile previously looked like. And I think at some point, a lot dealerships, especially in larger dealer groups, are going to start focusing on this because, it's such a large OpEx number for them annually. I bet, and I've seen it before where whether it's, a car dealership or it's somebody else where their electric bill goes up and, they think that they have an energy efficiency problem. So they call it the utility, they do an energy efficiency audit, and everything's fine. The only difference is how they're being charged. And it's not the utility's fault.
Right. Yeah.
It's not, the utility's building these general service rates that cover as many customers as possible. And the load profile for EV charging is just so unique that it's just important to have somebody that kind of understands that to protect you from really what are the biggest costs. And I think that's a big challenge for a lot of dealers. And then the other piece is like going back to like having a single solution. I think that's just so important, for so many different perspectives. Like, yes, Obviously you could create a sales strategy, but what happens when you have turnover between salespeople and between service people? And what if it's between 6 different brands? Like, it'd be so much easier if there was a culture around understanding how to initiate a charging session and how to talk about that charging station at the BMW dealership and then also at the Nissan dealership. And what's the cost of retraining employees across different locations when you have all these various solutions as opposed to a single solution? So, like there's just a lot to take into account beyond a station being a plug in the wall. And we've talked about this before, like, the switch from the CCS to the NACS, which I'm in support of personally.
Me too.
I think it's awesome. But how many stations are out there that have cables that might not be replaceable? And what's the plan?
And to your point, like, how many of the dealers or GMs are asking that question? I get it a couple, like, here and there throughout like the course of a week, but it's not nearly the volume of questions I was anticipating being asked. Like, Dave, what is ChargePoint's plan for the NACS? Right?
Yeah.
Like, what are you guys doing? And so I think it's even for the dealerships. I think to your bigger point here too is even knowing what questions to ask, I think is also a big part of this learning curve for them. There's
like
so much information to know and to learn and to
the size of a power module and a DC charger and how that impacts the charging experience based on
what's a kilowatt
state of charge. There's just there's just so much. And it's again, we've said it's the wild, wild west.
Yeah.
But it's also, where there's a challenge in a market, there's a huge opportunity for like a lot of these dealers and these dealerships too to be industry leaders right now.
I think so too. I think obviously with change comes opportunity. And I think to your point too, like, I think I'm really curious, and I don't know what this is going to look like, but I'm really curious too. You had mentioned like the utilities and rates, how software and artificial intelligence also starts to begin to play a factor into whether it's utility, whether it's dealerships or whatever it is, and how artificial intelligence starts to hopefully help is, I guess, where I'm going with this, and from a cost perspective, but I guess that remains to be seen too. But yeah.
Well, I think we're attracted to it for the same reason. We've said it a bunch of times. It's a fun, fast-paced, vertical to be in.
That's right.
That's for sure. That's for sure. Well, I guess my last question for you, if you were an EV charging, or just a company looking to do EV charging, like, what's the one piece of advice you'd give somebody who's like at the beginning right now of their decision-making process?
I think we, just encompassing like our conversation this afternoon, I think the biggest piece of advice, even with all the pressure coming perhaps from an OEM on deadlines, is to take your time with this, to speak with experts, right? Like yourself, right, Chris? Like, I mean, if I was a dealership, I would want to make sure that I'm just doing my due diligence, and I've got this list of questions that you and I kind of went through on this podcast, where you could literally listen to this and be able to ask either your partner, your channel partner, or your the company that you're working with, like a ChargePoint, and just see what their what their comfort level and knowledge base is on a lot of this stuff that we're talking about. And like, hey, Chris, how are you going to help me with utility rates? Like, that's a simple question that anybody can ask. And I think really have like an interview process and go through the right steps, right? Like with ChargePoint on our team, we want to make sure that we're, taking the 15 years of experience that we have and making sure that it's the customer's experience too, like they'll get all of that knowledge. And, in the end, even ChargePoint's competition, like, we're all on the same page or same team in the end, where I think we all do this because we want to do something bigger than ourselves. And we've got a sustainability focus too, that kind of gets us out of bed every morning, but it's a lot, man. So again, I think what's the Navy SEAL adage? It's slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right? Like, it's kind of like that's kind of the attitude you have to have with this, and almost have blinders on and block out a lot of the noise. So just slow down. That would be my one piece of advice. Yeah. Easier said than done. I know. Easier said than done.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. Cool.
Yeah.
And then my last bonus question for you. You think the Celtics are gonna take it this year?
Do I think the Celtics are gonna take it? Behind the Chicago Bulls, the Celtics are my number two. I hope so. What's going on with Jalen? Is he still there?
Oh yeah, he just signed the biggest contract in the history of the NBA.
Did he?
He's doing okay.
I love Stevens. I love what he's done over there and the team that he's built. It was a shame when like Tatum got hurt last year, obviously, like in the last game in the playoffs there. So yeah, man, I'm pulling for him. That city doesn't need any more championships though either. That city's got. How about spreading the love a little bit to Chicago? How about that?
We're not looking to spread any love at this point.
I know you're not. Yeah. Hey, can I ask you a bonus question, Chris?
Yeah.
For any of the entrepreneurs out there.
Yeah.
So, what's one thing that
I think I already know the answer.
You would love about kind of being your own boss and having your own company? And what's one thing that perhaps has caught you off guard that you were like, oh geez, that's a little bit harder than I initially thought it was going to be?
Oh, that's a great question. That is a great question. So the answer to the first one, which I knew the answer would be this, is I love learning.
Yeah. And yesterday, man, it's great to hear that.
Yeah. And so like, obviously being a new business owner, you have to learn a lot really fast, be nimble, and be ready to adapt, ready to like, learn about new things just in general. So I certainly have done that. And then, the most difficult the most difficult part is I love the fun stuff and like what we're doing right now and talking to customers about electrifying and like creating great solutions is really fun. But, the insurance and, that type of stuff, making sure that cash flow is effective and strong and all those things that, it's critical and do it every single day, but I can't say like it's like the fun part of it.
Yeah.
Sure,
education.
I would say like the thing that's been I know you didn't ask this question, but the most inspiring thing about doing something like this for me has been that, when you tell people that you're going to do something like this, like you're going to go off on your own and start a business, and you get hopefully what people believe and that you believe is like a really strong why, is that people want to support people starting businesses, especially other people who own businesses, have reached out and really helped, and it's been across the board. And so like I think that's the thing that's like it's kind of struck me, and it makes me want to help people who are starting something new. So yeah, I think that's been the coolest thing for me so far.
Yeah, that's a great answer, man. And you said it yesterday too. I love that you're like, it's nonstop learning and like just being a sponge and taking it all in, Yeah, it's fun to like on a daily basis become more diversified and just, a little bit better at everything. Yeah. As opposed to a few things. And so, the mantra that I know you would live by is that, you're always trying to put your best foot forward and kind of learn a little bit every day. And like, this is a great position to do that for me. Yeah. That's great, man. I'm stoked for it. Yeah. Well, hey, thanks for joining. Really appreciate it. This is fun. I hope I get invited back and we can just keep talking about like philosophy and things like that. Yeah. Not if you go down the Chicago Bulls route again. Right. Cool. Well, thanks for the time, and I'm sure we'll catch up soon. All right, buddy. Always a pleasure, man. I'll talk to you soon.